more than that, judges will not write it down. If you have any preference in terms of POI, in terms of gender pronouns, feel free to state that. Otherwise, we'll assume the default for POI it's chat. For gender pronouns, it's by using speaker position or neutral gender pronouns. Great, let's just start the debate. I welcome Prime Minister to open the case. Here.
はい。Am I visible and audible now?
You are.
Thanks. POI on chat please, and I preferably take from closing. Maybe 5 or 6. Starting 3, 2, 1. We believe US economy is actually shrinking and really in a dangerous situation. In such cases, this policy is generally good because decreasing government debt and bad things is actually good. And also we can appeal the most swing voters who is working on the things like construction corporation or the small businesses and so on. Very poor to propose. Three things and set up. Possible. We believe poor individuals opposition can appeal is out of this debate because things like individuals who is affected by the food stamp or the medical treatments will anyway vote for the other party, Democrats, because on the historically Democrats care about such a poor individuals and more importantly on the previous political elections, Harris is strongly message about such a medical treatment and food stamps and so on, which means even if such Republicans start to appeal such policies for the poor peoples, anyway, those poor people already decided to vote for the Democrats, which means that is completely meaningless voter blocks for such Republicans. Then they are to be this debate. Secondarily, we believe that we should target about the individuals, right-wing peoples, and relatively right-wing peoples, and sometimes swing voters. Things like working on the construction corporations who care about the economy, and sometimes they are relatively poor peoples, and they might care about such might be appealed by the other parties and so on. In order to appeal those individuals, decreasing state regulations because something like that is really important because those individuals, those relatively right-wing individuals, is the people who care about the U.S. freedom or the things like that care about hating the regulation and the big government, or the things like they wanna gain the more payments through their economy and corporations, small businesses and so on. This is the actual swing voters, and we must catch now. Then, three things. Firstly, why generally economy is really shrinking, and secondarily, why especially small businesses is really dangerous and we must save. And lastly, I explain why this is to attract general individuals. First of all, why economy is really weak in the US? There are several reasons. Firstly, UK or the China or the many other states is actually expanding its effect. Things like technological development, things like semiconductor from the Taiwan, or the things like EV from the UK and many other places. Those things actually are increasing its effect and is really scale for the US. Secondarily, things like BRICS or the many funding alternative system is expanding. Historically, US has the most strongest banking system, SWIFT. However, now things like BRICS establish a new funding system, especially targeted at the developing countries. In such cases, US now sometimes volatile situation in shrinking into such economical positions, they are losing their first mover advantage. Thirdly, things like Saudi Arabia or the things like North East not North, Middle East Middle East countries start to cater to the Chinese corporation. Not, for example, Saudi Arabia versus various Iran's battles. China will intervene, and China succeeded to mediate such two countries. And this is the obvious reasons why those countries started to tie with China, and started to isolate the US, because US is ignoring those Middle East since they have resources on their countries, but not losing resources is generally really bad things for the US. This is obviously one of the reasons why US is losing the power on the other countries. And lastly, retaliation tariff, and this is really important not only for the economy, but also for the especially small corporations. Why? Because retaliation tariff actually increasing the importing cost and the material cost from the other countries. It increases the things like price of the oils, or the things like price of the many materials and so on, which implies not and for those reasons, economy is really weak and shrinking, and especially small businesses who have no large economy of scale, who is like who is really like hesitating to hire the many expensive work labor forces and so on is actually so struggle now. In such cases, we need to appeal such individuals because, for example, retaliation tariff imply retaliation tariff implies relatively right-wing voter in such businesses is start to hesitating to supporting the keep to support the Republican Party now because retaliation tariff if retaliation tariff kills such economy, which means this is a betrayal for the such individuals who live on such a middle economies, which means other Republican parties, you can't betray those most traditional, most swing voters. You must appeal to those individuals. We don't betray you. We will protect your economy. So, in such cases, we need such a really appealing policy in order to protect and save those vulnerable individuals.
Hello?
Then, sorry, letters, media,
Hello?
and with this,
Am I audible?
what's, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry. I think it was me. I think it was my connection. Um, so you were lagging at 4 and 40 seconds.
Okay, 4 seconds.
Yes,
So I have more 3 minutes for it, right?
yes. 4 minutes
Uh,
and 40 seconds on my timer has
well,
passed. The last thing you were talking about is about um after retaliation tariff, and you go on and talk why small business are struggling, and then you got cut off after that.
yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so I restart in 3, 2, 1. Okay, for those reasons, those small corporations is struggle with hiring the many individuals and so on. Then, note, this implies the efficiency and necessity of the these policies because those relatively right-wing voters in such businesses is now hesitating to support the Republican parties because it might be potential betrayers from such Republican parties. Those individuals is promise to protect the economy, but now economy is shrinking. This is a betrayal, and things like Bernie Sanders or the media and the Democrats is strongly criticizing those shrink of the economy. In such cases, we now Republican needs some way a policy to protect those most swing voters who is now hesitating to keep support such a Republican parties. So in order to catch and appeal those individuals, we need this policy. Then this is the first interest and the first reasons why we must appeal to those small businesses. If we decrease the tax, obviously corporation can get benefit, and even if it is not true, appealing itself is really important. Secondarily, one big beautiful bill is compatible and best for the American identity. I want to talk about the general interest of the American individuals. Things like neoliberalism, things like free markets, things like freedom of the shrinking government regulation itself is a historically ideology of the US. US individual is instilling this narrative from the childhood, which means generally small government is really beneficial and interested for the most of the any large individuals who even for the atheists, who doesn't belong to any parties and so on. Those swing voter even have a strong even those swing voter instill the narrative such a US dream and so on. We can appeal to those individuals. And lastly, generally, decreasing state debt and state deficits is really important now because now there's a fear of the economy of the shrinking. And more importantly, there's an increase of the military budget is actually harming the US economy. Not things like previous government actually donates tons of the money into the and for the Ukraine, which means US and US citizens is actually now, oh, my country is losing tons of the money, tons of the soldiers. We utilize tons of the military expensive in order to save the other country. In such cases, those US citizens strongly understand there's an increase of the state debt, increase of the state deficit. In such cases, decreasing this deficit itself is a big appeal to those individuals in the US, average citizens. For those reasons, we're happy to stand.
Thank you so much.
Chat, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest problem of the OO is, although they are button push, they misses the characteristics of the what is swing voter, what is neutral voter. They said there's a backlash towards the Republican people because not having the healthcare system, not having like the food for the most poor people. Note, these people, the most vulnerable people in the society, anyway votes for the Republicans because obviously Republicans are historically the party who have mostly care about these types of vulnerable people in the society. And also, because Republicans have known these types of the facts and they're the stock voter for the Republicans, they're likely to continue that types of the supportive policy for these people. That is why these people are not the interest of the Republicans. Republicans' interest is more further. I think that some of them is included to the small businesses, and I think I can win in today's round. I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, why launching this BBB in and of itself is an interest of the Republicans. But secondly, why it succeeds. This is the most basic mechanism for the government side to win. And lastly, why the counterfactual, what they have to do, and why it's worse for the Republicans' reputation. So the first thing, why the launching it in and of itself is very good. Note, by launching the BBB, we can appeal to the many of the public to say, like, we have decided to reduce the deficit of the amount, the America at large amount of scale. Why it's very good? It's very good for the two reasons. Firstly, it is connected to avoid the future the decline of the future of the reputation. If you don't take this, like you're largely criticized by Democrat parties by saying you said to reduce the deficit, but have not acted at anyways. But in our side house, we can say we have acted in that way, but it doesn't work even at the worst case. Not appearing you have acted in a specific way in and of itself is good for the voters and sure about your first manifestation in the voting process and election. But next thing to say is, note, like it is also good for the immediate former supporter of the Republicans. Because like the significant amount of the swing voter have voted to the Republican at the former election. Why? Because they do not only cares about the immediate benefit, but cares about the 2 years or 3 years future which they face. Note, if the debt increases, if the debt compiles more and more, then it is more difficult for you to borrow more money because you have to pay more interest and your US economy generally go down. That's why the swing voter have voted for the Republican to reduce the amount of the deficit to make the healthy budget. That's what Republicans have promised. If you do not take this measure, you're largely criticized by these swing voters who have formally chosen for you to reduce the deficit. This is the biggest harm which they have to occur in their side of the house. Note, obviously, especially in the status quo, Doge, which is claimed for reducing the spending towards bureaucrats, have like somehow failed because of the Elon Musk and Trump's conflict. That is why we have to launch new system to appeal for the voters who want you to decrease the deficit. This is the lowest burden argument. Closing government have to do many jobs to take down this claim. Why your side of the house claim is more certain than this impact which necessarily stands for in today's round. Next thing I'm going to talk about is a BBB is likely to succeed. There's 3 reasons why it's likely to succeed. 1, because it reduces spending, obviously. And I have to point out, food spending, medical goods spending is especially high cost for the government. Why? Because in the status quo, there's the retaliation tariffs, and you have to import the goods in very high prices. But next reason is you can increase the revenue. These 2 ways is the main way for you to make the budget healthy. Why we can increase the revenue? Because to increase the revenue, we have to get the taxes. To have to cut taxes, we have to make more people to spend their money and to boost the economy. How to do this? 1, we will push people to spend more because we will cut off the supports and the material goods. That's why people have to buy more foods and services by themselves. But secondly, we can increase to increase the spending of the people, we have to increase the revenue of the people. How we do this? We will cut out the taxes for them. Then they get more revenue and they can spend for. That's why it is very important. They said, oh, the small businesses is so small number. it is untrue. 98% of the company is a middle or small company. And over the 50% of the people are belonging to the small or middle businesses. Note, this is not small number in the first place, but also there are structural reasons to like what smaller company is, the people who are belonging to the smaller company is rush, because going to the higher company have high entry bar because they want to pick the most competent person. That is why structurally there's less people in the large corporations. But the last reason why it's likely to succeed is because there's less counter-lobbying power from the large corporation, because the other ways you have to take is likely to increase the tax revenue, that increases the taxation and the regulation towards these large corporations. And I think this is very bad. Note, this is very important because this mechanism is the basis of any types of extension closing government can launch in the future round. Because, like, note that succeeding this policy is any types of the argument to say this policy is good requires why this policy succeeds. We have explained that. And the next thing to say is why deficit is so bad. Deficit is so bad because, like, as I said, the deficit will impede your economy, because in the future we have difficulty to borrow your money, because to borrow the money there is a more interest, there are more interest rate that you requires, and you have to pay back more money to the other countries. That's why we have to immediately cut off the deficit. But before that, yeah, I'll take your point from Seal.
So if you do tax cuts, then how are you getting more money to like reduce the deficit?
We will reduce the tax for the people, then they can have more revenue. Then if they have more revenue, they have more room to spend on the money, then they can boost on the economy. But in the other ways, we can directly reduce also the spending, and that's increases the revenue. That's why we can be better. But I have said also, like, even if this doesn't work, appearing that we have done something in and of itself is good. You have to take down this crime also. Then it is very clear that you have to reduce the deficit for a future generation, because in the future generation the problem would be more bigger, and the criticism coming from the Democrats would be more bigger, because the problem is here and more economically suffering. Then what they have to take instead of this plan, they have to, the only way they can improve their economy is to taxation for the large corporation. And I think that's very bad, because one, you have also ties with large corporation. In your electoral support is coming from large corporation. This is a deadlock tiebreaker, because even if the voter base point is washed, this support from the corporation uniquely comes in outside the house. For these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Okay. Leader of op retracted the consent. A note for OC. All right, next I welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition, Shaurya.
Hi, just want to check if I'm audible and clear.
Yes, you are.
Okay, just give me a few seconds and I'll get started. The first thing I want you to note is that if OG's best premise to win this debate is on recuperating your economy, they needed to first prove why small businesses are essential to achieving this in the first place, when we already characterized you that the large bulk of the US economy is hinged on big SMEs, big MNCs, such as your Silicon Valley companies and your SME 5, and your top 500 companies in the first place. No mechanism as to why this is possible. The second thing is correctly called out. Insofar as they don't explain how subsidizing tax that you're going to make people pay is now going to be the flipping point to getting more revenue, if the premise of giving this tax in the first place is one of the fact that these individuals need this tax. It's unclear to me as to how they're able to rebuild or refacilitate any form of economic growth in the first place. The first thing I want to do is to clarify the frame, because they don't engage on this, which is on the concurrent trajectory of large level conservative support. Note the premise of this. Pre-election and pre-detabling of this bill, it was already very probable in this world that there was already large levels in the West of large levels of growing conservative support. Look at Germany, for example. Look at the shift towards red in US at the point in which Trump was elected. Look at the fact that there's a growing growing narrative of conservatism. This can be attributed to a few factors. One, it's probably due to the Democratic Party itself losing credibility after the Biden administration. But two, it also manifests in ways whereby it's usually things like blue voters or grey voters oftentimes contemplating swinging more red during particular elections because A, they find the policies themselves more fundamentally effective on multiple fronts. This means that even before the tabling of this bill, there was already a natural trajectory towards conservatism that has already favored your Republican Party in the first place. The question then becomes, how does the tabling of this bill affect these particular trajectories? Is it one that makes it better or is it one that makes it worse? The simple push on opening opposition is that we explain to you that this is an unnecessary bill because it's counterproductive to the concurrent trajectory that the Conservatives have already built. The first question I want to answer here is what is going to happen to these goods or like to individuals on the ground the point in which you strip away these rights to Medicare and like food subsidies in the first place. Yan Joo already posits to you that the natural trajectory of people subscribing is one that has already happened. The point in which you the point in which you pass this particular bill and remove these forms of things is when you inherently target an attack on inelastic goods. It is considered that healthcare is already relatively expensive within the US, and sure, conservatives do inherently value economic growth. However, you need to note, Judge, that irrespective of your political background, things like healthcare, things like food are inherently important to individuals on the ground, irrespective of their political ties. Just because these are fundamental proximate needs to your livelihood in the first place. The problem here that arises is insofar as these things become significantly more inaccessible for individuals, is when you're likely to see things like individuals struggling in the first place to access these things. The harm here is simple. These are things that are constantly needed in the first place for the large bulk of individuals. It is unclear even under their model where they get like lesser taxes and better livelihoods for people as to how people are going to be able to more likely be able to afford these things insofar as prices of these things are likely to increase. The harm of this firstly is on a micro level in the round. Firstly, on individuals within the Republican Party, we think this is likely to impact their livelihoods to some level of degree, creating some levels of uncertainty. This probably won't manifest in the worst forms or ways of backlash against your party. Perhaps that's an unlikely outcome, but it's the swing voters and the swing demographics that are probably going to be most affected by this, and this is the most proximate thing to the Republican interest, which is twofold. One, to continue to stay in power and gain more election power. Two, this probably comes in the way by which you're able to swing more voters and still maintain a majority chokehold against the concurrent Democratic Party that's struggling. The likely outcome here is that this is probably an avenue of weaponization for your Democratic Party, but secondarily also a level of deterrence for the large bulk of people who want to swing into your country. The reasons for this is simple. It is very natural for a Democratic Party that is inherently premised on the ideas of more accessible healthcare and fundamental needs to individuals to flip this narrative against you, to inherently view this as a way of individuals losing their rights to fundamental needs in the first place. The problem with this bill is that it inherently gives an avenue to your Democratic Party to bounce back and recover themselves in the political sphere to then be contentious towards the Republican Party. We argue to that this is an inherent harm in the first place because one, it's likely to sway back swing voters who are contemplating this particular side of the aisle because this is viewed as a fundamental proximate need that's fundamental to democratic perceptions but also essential to the average human on the ground irrespective of your political stance. The simple tipping point here is that on our side, our proposal is to simply not pass this bill. The essential importance here is that insofar as we're not taking further allocations away from Medicaid and further allocations away from food, means we're relatively operating on a somewhat compromising stance here. The value of this stance, even if it's not to the fullest level of Republican principles, is valuable. Because firstly, not passing the bill means you don't necessarily put the current trajectory that you have at risk. But secondarily, this is good because you don't provide the Democrats an avenue to weaponize this against you in order to create some level of voter turnover in their favor. The impact here becomes that we continue to stay on this concurrent trajectory that currently exists. We think this is winning on a political side and on a way in which we're able to buy in swing voters by virtue of the characterization that we gave you earlier that this OG did not dislodge. The second thing I want to deal with here is their big foot. And the second thing I want to deal with here is why Republicans are not going to freak out the point in which you not buy this bill. First, politics is multifaceted because the Republicans subscribe, or the truest forms of Republicans subscribe because of multiple different agendas that the party has. Things like a free market, things like abortion policy, things like LGBTQ stances are all multiple reasons why people stay within a Republican Party. The difference here is that this is not passing a bill as opposed to passing a bill that's hostile to an actor that wants to swing in your favor. The tipping point here is that inaction is significantly something that's more accepted by people towards their governments as opposed to passing things that are actively hostile or viewed as directly impacting your livelihood in a negative way. This is why the tipping point to this debate is people continuing to support the Republicans. We don't think Republicans lose any support. But the last thing I want to talk about here is on the economy here. The first thing I want to explain to you here here is why small businesses are unlikely to become the tipping point to recovering the US economy and why there are other alternatives to do this. The first thing I want to explain to you is that the US operates on a free market system that has one of the lowest taxation rates in the world and lesser forms of bureaucracy. This is why you have things like large forms of FDI into Silicon Valley, large forms of investment in that of itself. The significance of this is it's very simple because they don't posit to you why these tax cuts are going to lead to any form of substantial change to tip the economy in the first place. We argue to you at best the benefit that you get is marginal, but it's also circular because the same individuals who get these tax cuts are now burdened by higher levels of Medicare and higher levels of food costs. We think this is a circular problem that they don't find any resolution for. The importance here is that on our side, alternatives like recovering the economy still exist. Things like reducing bureaucratic processes, things like encouraging more FDI. These are all things that you can do absent of wanting to simply pull out money from Medicare and pump it into smaller businesses. These are more sustainable and secure ways in which you're able to operate the US economy. Two reasons why this is in the incentive of the Republican Party. First, relaxing regulations are likely to align with libertarian principles that Republicans oftentimes have. You cannot adjudicate this debate solely on the metrics of Trump's presidency. This is an evaluation of fundamental Republican principles as a whole. This means it's important. This means things like free markets, free trade, lesser regulations, libertarian rights to engage with agency in the market are all things that Republican parties inherently support. We think these are more tangible solutions to achieve the change that they want to talk about. This inherently has a trickle-down effect to help your smallest businesses in the first place because this is when your economy recuperates and you're more likely to be able to give things like subsidies in the future without having to pull this out from other allocations of funding that are inelastic and fundamental to individual rights. For those reasons,
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Moving on to the closing bench debate, I welcome member of GUF. You're here.
Yeah. Am I audible?
You are.
Okay. More than Medicaid, more than food stamps, what we say the swing voters care about is not these handouts. They want to keep their jobs which give them their dignity, their jobs which give them their autonomy over having an income and being able to choose what to spend it on. Because when they start to see things like more Japanese cars on the street, when they see Chinese steel replacing American steel, they are worried that their factory that they work at is going to be next. We're going to talk about swing voters, why they are the most important actor in this debate where it concerns the Republican Party. But first, I want to symmetrize a lot of what OG says, because they say some voters care about ideology, and I guess OO just said this as well on DLO. But the thing is that most people will still support the Republican Party due to the fact that there are no alternatives. If you're someone who truly believes in something like small government, it is always going to be true that on the comparative, the Republican Party will stand more for small government than the Democratic Party ever will, which means that ideology is really a non-issue in this debate. And notably, you're unlikely to leave if you already vote for things like the Republican Party or the Democrat Party due to historical or family ties because of the place in which you grew up, due to things like less contestation. If you already live in a red state, it is less likely that a Democrat will try to reach out to you in this red state because he knows that it's a futile effort in this regard. The second thing to talk about is government debt. I just simply don't see why the average voter cares about government debt. The first reason is that a lot of these economic concepts that are very abstract tend to be very difficult for the average individual to understand because they are just less proximate to you compared to things like your job, compared to things like inflation, which you see every single day when you check your wallet, when you try to check out at Walmart, for example. And all of this is to say that it is much more likely that people care about the things that are much more visible to them than anything else. The second thing to say is just that the logic in OG about reducing government debt is just incredibly uncertain, as CO fairly pointed out in their point of information. Now, on to two things. The first is on jobs. I want to quickly give you a characterization of what swing voters look like, because it is not as OG characterized, i.e. they are not small business owners. This is a very small quantity, and OO fairly point out that there is really an unclear margin on this in the debate. What we say instead, the real characterization of swing voters is that they tend to live in small industrial towns and states like Scranton, Pennsylvania, or Flint, Michigan. In these areas, they do jobs that often involve secondary production, like the production of steel, copper, and cars. And note here that it is most likely that if you're one of these people, your job is most likely to be threatened by globalization, by the rise of China and the rise of a lot more industrial states that can produce all of these goods at much more lower costs than you and your firm could ever do. This looks like Nippon Steel threatening to come into the US and take over local factories. It looks like seeing more Chinese and Japanese cars on the road instead of the American and homemade cars. And note here that you really just cannot compete on cost in a lot of these cases, which often means either that you see a wage falling if you're an American factory worker, or that you literally just lose your job and your ability to make an income. The conclusion here is that this is incredibly important in terms of the framing, because it is only Donald Trump who protects these people through things like tariffs and through things like keeping foreign firms out. The change here is that you are more likely to keep your job insofar as you keep foreign firms out. But secondly, the cultural touchstones, i.e., like the factory that your grandparents, your parents, and you expect your children to work at, are much more likely to stay in business. And these are the things that give you pride and a sense of nationalism. But why is the big, beautiful bill necessary to make tariff policy work and thus necessary to keep these firms alive? We can see that, firstly, tariffs may make goods more expensive, which is fairly pointed out by opening government, and therefore firms may see a fall in profits in the short run. But secondly, that industrial transition through these tariffs takes time. What we say, therefore, is that the big, beautiful bill is really an important short-term stopgap measure, because having more tax cuts for a lot of these industrial firms, like factories, allows them to stay in business because it offsets the increase in cost, which means then that they can do things like ensure that workers are still continuing to stay employed while keeping foreign firms out. And therefore, that's when you start to see a long-term rise in profitability, because they have less competition and are much more able to care for the swing voters, for the average industrial workers in these states. You're less likely to see foreign takeovers, and you're much more likely to see these factories stay in business. The next thing that I want to talk about is inflation and how the big, beautiful bill specifically affects import costs. Because if you notice the past 2 weeks of financial reports that have come out, a lot of firms have talked about how they have had to absorb the cost of the increase in costs due to the tariffs. The thing here to note is that the tax cuts through the big, beautiful bill allow for things like these firms to stay in business, for them to absorb the costs that they would otherwise have had to incur in terms of an increase in price because of the tariff policy. Why is this true? I.e., why is it hard for a lot of these firms to raise prices in the status quo? The fundamental thing to stay here is that raising your prices is really a prisoner's dilemma. I.e., as a firm, you have imperfect information about how other firms are going to price, how other firms receive costs and receive their revenue. You are scared that if you alone raise prices, other firms are just going to stay put, and therefore that you will lose revenue. Therefore, you are much more likely to hold back from raising prices as much as you possibly can. And therefore, we say that when you have a tax cut, you create a larger buffer for firms to absorb this increase in prices, because firms are naturally competitive and because they want to ensure that they are able to keep their business. But before I move on, I'll take that POI from Zixuan.
Yeah, so the one big beautiful bill also involves increasing taxes for the average middle income person. So why is it then that they get the benefit that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I guess you would have to weigh here on the severity of losing your job and or the severity of keeping your job and having marginally higher taxes, if we even accept that it is true that the big beautiful bill increases your taxes. What is the most important thing to say generally about taxes is that they are marginal, i.e., you increase the taxes for each bracket, and it is much more important that you have a base amount of money that you're able to do things like pay for your child's education with, pay for your food with, pay for your healthcare with. And it is much more important that we use jobs as a metric rather than other things like handouts, because it is connected to things like dignity and autonomy, which most people value, because it is connected to things like culture, like seeing your family and friends work at the same factory, like local factory that you've worked at in a long time. Okay, continuing on about like my whole prisoner's dilemma analysis, what we say here is that tax cuts allow these firms to stay in business without raising prices. And this takes OO in two ways. The first is that we show that we are much more able to get jobs on our side, which is incredibly proximate to the average individual who lives in these swing states. But the second thing is that we also take them insofar as we are able to show that you have cheap goods. Once you have cheaper goods, you're able to have a higher standard of living insofar as you're able to increase your consumption of these goods, which also, I guess, responds to Zixuan's POI about how you're able to increase the standard of living for the individual. For all these reasons, never been prouder to propose.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Next, I call upon member of OP here.
Hello, I would like my POIs in chat, please. OG says this bill will help the US economy. OO says this will hurt people on the ground. I'm going to do the big comparative bill and explain how this makes the US economy worse, winning on opening government's metric, filling in the missing engagement in OO, and also proving a larger impact. And this also conveniently flips the CG extension on how it creates jobs and provides a buffer for businesses. So let's first analyze how the big beautiful bill will most definitely increase the US budget deficit. If we can successfully prove, this will explain why the Republican leadership would be viewed as incompetent, especially because Republicans have the trifecta, right? They have the presidency, they have the House of Representatives, and the Senate. So they can no longer blame Democrats for not passing their bill. So there is a lot of scrutiny on this big, beautiful bill as the one time when Republicans are able to get what they want, and people are observing whether this has a net good or net negative effect on the US economy. The crucial framing is that the Republican Party's main policy platform was always about reducing the budget deficit. They consistently employ debt ceiling brinksmanship against Democrats historically, refusing to raise the debt ceiling and demanding for spending cuts instead. And this is something that even Republican voters agree with because Republican voters feel as if Democrats are a bit too liberal in their deficit spending. So, successfully reducing the deficit is not just an ideological interest of the GOP, it's also a promise that they must deliver to maintain legitimacy. I will now explain why the Big Beautiful Bill should be renamed the Big Bad Bill. Firstly, it was just rushed through Congress. It is thousands of pages with many Republican lawmakers randomly amending provisions and adding provisions. There was literally not enough time to scrutinize or discuss or debate over all of the random changes in the bill because every single Republican lawmaker tried to have their hands in the pie and add random provisions for their own billionaire friends. Analysts are forecasting that it will add to the deficit. The US Treasury rating has been recently downgraded as a result of them feeling like this bill will make the US more fiscally irresponsible. But secondly, the math just doesn't work out for this bill. The bill has a lot of tax cuts for Trump's billionaire friends and big businesses, which means that the US is losing millions in tax revenue that they would have otherwise gotten from those big businesses. It wasn't just about keeping small businesses afloat because of the tariffs, as closing government says. It was also about increasing the profit margins for all of these billionaires. Trump was going to make up the shortfall of tax revenue with tariff money and closing government agencies, but Trump has paused the tariff, the Supreme Court has struck down the executive action, and there's global pushback against Trump's tariffs. And the plan to improve government efficiency and close down departments in governments failed miserably because Elon Musk and Trump had like a really public breakup, right? So all of the measures that Trump was going to use to make up for the fact that they have less tax revenue or have not really worked out, which explain that there's a huge gap in the budget right now where Trump is losing a lot of money from the tax cuts he's giving to billionaires. Opening government says the US economy is shrinking, and so the bill helps with this competitiveness. CG makes a better version of this argument by talking about job creation and talking about the buffer for small companies or big companies as well. But this assumes that the bill is economically sound, but it's likely going to mess up the deficit, which is the logical prior premise for both government teams to achieve their outcome of improving the economy. This damages the economy, depreciates the USD, there's a loss of investment in the US stock markets. All of these harms are because of the Big Beautiful Bill, which flips both government teams' benefit to economy and jobs. And the reason why this is a claim that closing opposition makes not OO, because OO's math here is like deeply sus, right? They say that when healthcare costs increase, that's bad for the economy, which there's actually no real link between the cost of healthcare to macroeconomic impacts. That's not the way it worked. We told you about it was about US credit rating that was affected because the bill was just all over the place. So the US is losing more tax revenue that it cannot gain from spending cuts, and I have two observations to make therefore. The first, this means spending cuts are likely to be more aggressive and more severe to make up for tax cuts, which hurts more people, including Republican voters. So, even if you believe that Republican voters tend to be middle class, the fact that more spending cuts have to be done means that it's going to encroach on the livelihoods of even middle class Republican voters. But secondly, many Republican voters were just hurt by cuts to Medicaid. Opening government says poor people vote Democrat, which is famously untrue. Trump's voter base comprised of the working class from the Rust Belt, blue-collar individuals disenchanted with Democrat elites, as CG correctly identifies. Many of them are reliant on state welfare and only realized that after Trump took away their prescription medication and suddenly the cost of healthcare doubled for all of these Republicans overnight. And the reason why they didn't realize that they were on Medicaid is because all of these Republicans are just misinformation pilled and consume a bunch of Fox News and Charlie Kirk, so they didn't realize they were on Medicaid, and after the bill passed, they saw their medical bills triple overnight. OO asserts this characterization. We actually do the legwork to prove why many Republicans were hurt by cuts to Medicaid. Even if you believe the bill could fix the deficit, we explain the core voter base that Trump has, which is the working class, will be disenchanted. I know what you might be thinking. But opening opposition says there'll be increase in cost of living, so maybe CO is running a vertical here. We'll do them one better. We'll explain why this causes internal fracturing within the Republican Party. First, the loyalties in the GOP are shifting and inconsistent. Many Republicans are outspoken against Trump and his economic plans. Ron DeSantis and Mitt Romney feel like Trump is going to run the US economy to the ground and previously have been outspoken against Trump. When the bill fails or is is perceived to be rushed or not planned, it emboldens the anti-Trump faction. This will fracture the Republican Party and split the Republican vote, which hurts them in the next midterm. And this means that there's not enough cohesion within the Republican Party to stand behind Trump's next successor, which is likely going to be J.D. Vance. So even if CG is right, that voters don't care about the deficit, Republican lawmakers definitely care about the deficit, and this will cause fracturing over rallying behind Trump's next successor. Before I explain the second extension or closing, do you have anything? If not, opening.
Yeah, if you increase the military budget or something like that, anyway, like you need some more tax revenue and your budget is actually shrinking. Why you can be better?
Oh, but Trump is decreasing the military spending because he wants to be more isolationist, right? So Trump is incredibly reliant on his business connections with billionaires. That's the basis of influence of the Republican Party, which funds their campaigns, right? The billionaires fund their campaigns. But businesses are going to be hurt by this bill, not least because tariffs have increased import costs for intermediary goods, and US manufacturers famously import a lot of raw material from developing countries, which means that the tariffs that Trump implemented has just like quadrupled the kind of production costs in the US, which is why tariff cuts were used to justify why they can pay for the tax cuts to billionaires, but not really working out for them economically. Think of how much instability has been caused in stock markets because of the passing of this bill. This is when companies that previously backed Trump now start to back Democrats or anti-Trump factions because the tariffs that Trump implemented directly hurt their bottom line in terms of production costs. So when closing government says that they'll create more jobs, so this is a buffer for some of the businesses to have larger profit margins because of the tax cuts, this must be weighed against the other things that was done, for example, the tariffs, that caused massive losses to this business. I want to now weigh this above opening opposition because OG and CG are partially right. Republican voters will always vote Republicans because they can't live with themselves to vote Democrats, right? Since this is the observation CG makes. OO says cuts to Medicaid will hurt Republicans, but they don't prove the tipping point for why life being more difficult means that a Republican would vote Democrat. We explained it wasn't actually about the voters. It was about Republicans losing corporate support. It was about Republicans getting fractured and infighting, which makes the GOP crumble because it emboldens the anti-Trump faction and causes them to be unable to decide on the next successor when there's a primary deciding the next president.
Thank you so much for that fun speak. Next, I call upon Government Whip. Here. CG?
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's first take a look at CO. I think the main thing they push for is this ideological principle about reducing the budget deficit. Two main responses here. Number one, I think Republicans aren't actually concerned about reducing the deficit, but they just use deficit concerns as justification for cutting programs that they ideologically oppose, right? Just like how Republicans regularly support like massive deficit increasing policies when they align with conservative goals, things like tax cuts, defense spending, like subsidies to business, etc. They only really discover fiscal responsibility when they're discussing social programs. And the same politicians who vote for trillion-dollar tax cuts suddenly become like deficit hawks when discussing about food stamps. I think Cavan tries to tell us that there's going to be some Republican infighting that is caused by the issue over deficit fighting, but I think that's fundamentally untrue. A lot of these Republican voters, be it J.D. Vance, etc., are beholden to their like patron clients or whatsoever, and as long as they support these deficit increasing policies such as tax cuts for them, I think that's what matters. This deficit reduction thing doesn't really matter. But even if it does matter, I will posit to you that the bill just results in the perception that budget deficit is being reduced. Because let me genuinely ask you, is this like Rust Belt worker going to actually read The Economist and do the math and see whether the budget deficit is going to be reduced? No, all it's going to care about is just the big headlines, and the big headlines are screaming in every single like Trump Twitter speech and every single like mega news that they themselves concede is going to be the primary base of these Republican voters are that the big beautiful bill is meant to reduce the budget deficit, right? I think logically this just does make sense for Republicans, like these like voters, etc., because they genuinely believe that cutting taxes and regulations will generate enough economic growth to replace lost revenue and make deficit concerns like irrelevant, right? Their perception is that lower taxes, businesses invest more, economic expansion, higher total tax revenue, despite like lower rates, or reduced government spending, private sector efficiency efficiency, overall economic improvement. So I think this really just doesn't matter. But the second thing is we are the ones that achieve it more because all what matters is just the perception towards these voters. But now let's take a look at the second push from CO. And note that CO tries to like co-opt a lot of what OO says, but they just say that we have like better analysis. But I think it's fundamentally just very derivative from what OO says, right? I think what like they try to say on both C and O is this idea of like reducing healthcare and it's why it's very bad. Three things here. Number one, note that many of these Republican voters actually have alternative healthcare coverage, right? Many Republican voters, especially like the targeted blue-collar industrial workers, have healthcare through their employers, right? So for example, like union jobs, manufacturing positions, they typically come with like very decent healthcare benefits, right? So because of that, they're less reliant on government programs and they're not as affected by these like Medicaid like cuts. Also, the second thing is that older Republican voters just tend to rely on Medicare rather than Medicaid, and Medicare tends to be like it remains untouched in this like BBB thing. But the second thing is that Medicaid cuts target very like different demographics, right? So your Medicaid expansion, given it's pioneered by like Obama and your Mitt Romney states, etc., primarily benefits urban areas and like Democrat-leaning states, but a lot of red industrial areas didn't expand Medicaid or have lower like enrollment rates. So these like rural Republican voters, that the swing voters, often just lack access to Medicaid accepting providers anyway. So the cuts would just like affect blue state urban populations rather than like these red state industrial workers. But I think the third thing that I want to say here is even if it is true that these like healthcare programs, etc., help them or not, these Republicans simply do not want these programs, right? This is because of this idea. There's a very strong identity investment amongst these Republican voters, especially these swing voters, being like productive rather than being dependent, right? These programs threaten this identity even when the recipients are workers. So cutting these programs reinforce the moral superiority of like work over insistence, and it creates very clear identity categories that preserve this idea of self and social status, which we posit you as the most important things for these like swing voters, right? And these swing voters are going to be very happy because what the perception of the big beautiful bill to them is that the hardworking Americans who like paid into the system will have access to earn benefits. These cuts will just like target waste and like fraud. These able-bodied, crucially immigrants, given the high like anti-immigrant sentiment, that should be working instead of living off taxpayers, and we are protecting benefits for those who like truly need them. So I think we've taken down the CUNO idea of like a Medicaid of the healthcare in two main ways. Number one, we tell you that oftentimes like it's not as if you're cutting Medicaid like fully, right? We think they still have Medicaid they still have like Medicare and alternative healthcare coverage. And the second thing is that they will be happy with these, even if that isn't true, they will be happy with these healthcare cuts just because of this Republican idea of small government. So I think that's the big clash on like healthcare taken out of like the debate. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to also weigh over some of like OO's extraneous arguments, right? Because I think OO also has this argument where they try to tell us that, oh, like we're gonna win on like big businesses, etc. Small businesses just aren't really as important. A few things here. I think if they really want to talk about big businesses, we also win on that ground, right? Because if you look at it, a lot of this like big beautiful bill, there's a lot of subsidies for these rich clients, right? For example, I think they're offering like $50,000 or something to the whaling industry. So I think we win even on that ground too. But now the next thing that I want to do is I also want to very quickly deal and weigh over OG, right? So I think what OG tries to tell us is this like very idea about reducing budget deficit and why that's so important and whatsoever. But I think the fundamental issue is that they just don't deal with the true idea of swing states, right? Why do you think swing states or swing voters tend to be those from red industrial states rather than small businesses? Number one, because your key swing states like Pennsylvania, etc., have large like industrial bases, and these states tend to be have like Republican rural like leaning areas, but your competitive suburban these states have like Republican leaning rural areas, but competitive like urban areas due to industrial workers. So small businesses are distributed everywhere and they just don't create the specific geographic concentration needed for swing dynamics, right? Even if you look at like red industrial states, it's like battleground states like West Virginia, etc., they were traditionally Democratic units, but they have flipped Republicans, right? So these contain large populations of culturally conservative, economically like populist workers, and they were red in recent elections, but margins can shift shift based on economic messaging. Versus small business owners in these areas are really very reliably Republican, right? They consistently oppose regulation, taxes, and government programs. They're less likely to swing based on populist economic appeals. On that logic alone, we think the far more important idea is about these great industrial states, which only Russell protects you through his argument how we basically reduce how due to the increase in tariffs and reduction in taxes result in far greater jobs rather than just like very long line of logic that OG wants to push about reducing budget deficit that will in turn reduce revenue. At its core, I think Russell's logic allows us to reach that point of generating jobs far better and far convincingly. Vote CG.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Next, Aklopan Upwip, here.
Hello, am I, sorry, audible and visible? Yes,
Yes, you are.
okay, yeah. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The main CG claim is that because the One Big Beautiful Bill allows Republicans, specifically those within the Rust Belt, to keep their jobs, therefore, the Republican Party gets to keep their swing votes. But actually, they don't prove why is it that for either, firstly, they will retain or even increase their jobs, right? The reason is very simple. First, most companies have already imported cheap Chinese steel or other like very important cheap materials in advance because of the announcement of the tariffs, which then means that the demand for the US made goods is still not very high. So at most, the tax cuts for these US steel companies just allows them to get by. They might still do stuff like income cutting for the like workers that they still employ or even still retrench them. And it's still likely to happen precisely because of how the tariffs have been playing out. Like Trump's not implementing a lot of them. They are probably which then means that the US steel companies are still unable to compete with most of the cheaper steel companies across the globe, for example, especially because uniquely in the US, the fact that they have to pay workers like a higher minimum wage compared to other countries means uniquely that their cost of production for steel is just going to be like a lot higher than Vietnamese or like Chinese steel, no matter what they do. The second thing to note, and like whatever like dropping of the US dollar recently is not enough to change that. So even in their best case, the other even in their best case where the other companies do still buy US steel because the tariffs do apply and therefore like buying US steel is cheaper, the increased cost of buying materials from the US companies, the US steel producers, still means that the cost of living goes up in a lot of these places. What this then means is that even if these individuals do keep their jobs, their cost of living is still very high and therefore their lives are still very hard. So like whatever Russell tells you about stuff like dignity doesn't actually change because just because you have a job doesn't mean your life is easy, right? It probably still means that you are going to be living from paycheck to paycheck. It probably means that you are struggling to put food on the table. And that's the reason why even on their best case where you do get to like retain the jobs for these swing voters, like it's far more likely that it doesn't actually change much. But more importantly, the like how to say the CG also just doesn't prove the margin on this. So they say that you get to keep this group of swing voters, that's why it's important. But at the same time, this group of this group of voters that they are talking about are those within the Rust Belt. And that's the precise demographic that Trump has already captured because they have ever since 2016, there have been the people who have been voting for Trump precisely because Trump is the only individual who cares about these people and how they have been disenfranchised by the Democratic Party, which then means that even if their lives do get worse, they are not going to change their votes anyway. And that's the reason why changing their minds or whether maintaining their job is probably still not something that Trump himself would prioritize. Like this group of individuals will not vote Democrat either way. So therefore they whatever benefit that they prove to you doesn't actually change the outcome. Now let me deal with some of their miscellaneous responses. So they say that the Republicans don't really care about the deficit because they clearly support other bills with tax cuts. But the problem with this is that firstly, a lot of the times the Republicans don't vote for these bills because they don't care about the deficit. They vote for these bills because they are free market capitalists and therefore they believe that this actually causes the economy to become better. So that's not the deficit is not the main reason why they're voting for the bill. But even if it is, in their best case, like there's a reason for why they thought that it was okay to vote for this bill, which is the fact that they thought that the governmental efficiency doge and Elon Musk would like cut sufficient funding from the government departments such that you can make up for that deficit either way. So the failure of the Republican Party to sufficiently do that is the reason why they like it's currently biting them in the ass essentially. But more importantly, there's something very crucial here, which is that the mechanism that Cavan provides to you about how the big beautiful tax cuts and the tariffs in combination has decreased the ratings of the US treasuries is extremely important because that increases the borrowing costs of the US government. The reason is because they have to increase the interest rate of these US treasuries, which then means that in the future the US has to pay back more to these like people who bought the treasuries, right? Which then means that the deficit is far worse because like not only is it harder for more people to buy your treasuries because they are now seen as unsafe, you also have to pay people more in interest when and therefore it puts more pressure on the US government to ensure that the economy does well. And clearly what we have proven to you here is that the economy will be like dog shit after Trump is done with it, right? And therefore it severely hurts their capacity to pay back that added interest. And that's the reason why it's extremely bad for the US right now, especially if you pass this bill, which causes the deficit to increase further. So our comparative is simply that you don't pass the bill, is going to be far better because you don't have to pay back as much deficit. The last thing to note is that our stuff about party factoring is the most certain and the most important in this debate because the midterm is actually very important. The Republican Party currently has a trifecta, as Cavan explains. They have the executive, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And this is especially important because their margins of how much majority they have in the House of Representatives and the Senate is actually quite small. And that's the reason why even though they have passed the bill, the midterm elections coming up for these parliamentary seats means that they have to be very careful. And the moment that the Republican vote splits, that's the point at which they lose the majority in either one of these places and therefore cannot pass bills anymore. Before I move on, OG. Oh, sorry, CG. If not OG.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I've explained just appealing to the voters to reduce the debt is so important. How do you reduce the debt in your side, or do you think the decreasing the debt is not so important?
So even if we obviously we can't say that we don't have to say we decrease the deficit, but at the very least we don't increase it by implementing a big beautiful bill, right? Like very clear. Okay, so now I'll deal quickly with OG and COO. So PM asserts that the big beautiful bill will better the economy. DPM gives some mechanism for explaining why the cutting food stamps and increasing spending from consumer will stimulate the economy. But that's not how economics works. If previously if consumers use the food stamps to buy rice, they can now use their own money to go and treat themselves and buy a TV or whatever, right? But the fact that they now have to spend their own money on food means that they're unable to use their own money to stimulate the economy in productive ways, and therefore their mechanism just doesn't work. The economy is not stimulated. This therefore takes out their one and only mechanism. For OO, it's Cavan that explains to you why uniquely that the mechanism of how many Republican voters realized that they were on Medicaid previously. So we proved their metric, but also they don't OO suffers from a similar problem with CGS. They don't prove the tipping point as to why this group of individuals will change their vote.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. That marks the end of the debate. You may cross floors, shake hands virtually. Thank you so much, everyone.